Tokyo Bay, September 2nd, 1945. The morning air is still, heavy with the scent of oil and salt. Across the deck of the USS Missouri, the war that consumed half the planet is ending. Japanese officers stand in press uniforms, eyes fixed forward, faces carved from discipline. Cameras click softly in the breeze. Among the observers on shore and aboard nearby vessels are nurses, clerks, and communications women from the Imperial Services. The few permitted to witness the ceremony. They watch the Americans move with an ease that feels almost impossible. Sailors grin as they adjust ropes. Marines stand relaxed, helmets tilted back, some smiling, as if the moment were not the sum of millions of deaths. To the Japanese women raised in a world where solemnity was virtue and emotion a private act, the sight is disorienting. These men had conquered their empire, yet they smiled, not in arrogance, but with something quieter, a confidence that came from somewhere beyond orders or propaganda. In that still September light, a question forms, whispered to the ranks of uniformed women. How could an enemy smile without fear? That question would echo across the ruins of post-war Japan. And to understand it, we must go back, before the surrender. In the final years of the Pacific War, Japan's world was collapsing in slow motion. By 1944, the once proud empire stretched thin across islands it could no longer defend. The Imperial Japanese Army still held vast territories, from Burma to the Philippines, yet supply lines had fractured under relentless Allied pressure. Cities like Manila and Rubble, once fortified strongholds, had become tombs of isolation. Every ship lost to American submarines tightened the noose around Japan's perimeter. Inside the homeland, daily life was an unending march of sacrifice. Men fought in distant jungles. Women took their places in factories, hospitals, and communication centers. The Imperial Rule Assistance Association called it the total war for the nation's survival. By mid-1944, the government began mobilizing women under the Joshi Taishintai, the Women's Volunteer Corps. They were clerks, nurses, telephone operators, and logistics assistants. A few wore military insignia. Most did not. But all were taught that surrender was shame, and that to serve the emperor was the highest form of purity. In the barracks and classrooms where these young women trained, lessons mixed discipline with fear. They learned to type and transcribe code, to manage supplies, and, most importantly, to suppress weakness. Photographs from the era show them standing in perfect rows, eyes forward, faces impassive. Any sign of softness was considered unpatriotic. Smile only when victory is certain, one wartime poster read. Yet by 1945, victory was no longer imaginable. Across the Pacific, the United States fought with a very different rhythm. Its war machine was industrial. Its soldiers rotated and resupplied at a pace Japan could not match. Even amid the horrors of Guadalcanal or Polilliu, American forces were surrounded by a constant flood of letters, cigarettes, chocolate, and film reels. Morale was not left to chance. It was engineered. The U.S. Army Service Forces published manuals on keeping soldiers fit and cheerful. Baseball games were staged in forward zones. Bob Hope's voice reached island camps through static radios. These were small comforts, but they gave the illusion of normalcy, of home never being too far away. To Japanese observers, especially those raised in the austerity of wartime Tokyo, this behavior seemed impossible. How could men laugh while surrounded by death? How could they face annihilation with grins? The cultural gap was vast. In Japan, restraint equaled honor. In America, open emotion, even humor, was proof of resilience. One culture worshipped silence, the other celebrated noise. As Allied bombing intensified, Tokyo's night skies turned red. Firestorms devoured neighborhoods, yet order was maintained through duty. Women in uniform tended to the wounded in underground shelters, their faces lit by kerosene lamps. Many had never seen an American up close. Propaganda described them as merciless giants or half-human beasts. But in August 1945, that image began to crack. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shattered the illusion of invincibility. For the first time, Japan faced a weapon that made every calculation meaningless. Hospitals overflowed. Communications networks faltered. The emperor's decision to surrender came like a voice from another world, divine, distant, final. When his words echoed to the radio on August 15th, many women officers fell to their knees, not in relief, but in disbelief. Surrender was a concept outside their education. As American ships approached Japanese shores, the imperial government issued orders to maintain composure. Soldiers were told to remain expressionless before the victors. Female personnel were warned, show no weakness. showed no emotion. But human nature does not always follow command. Beneath the facade of calm, curiosity stirred. In scattered airfields and hospitals, whispers began spreading about the Americans, their behavior, their confidence, their inexplicable smiles. The war had ended, but an entirely new kind of confrontation was beginning, one not fought with weapons, but with demeanor, language, and small, unguarded gestures. The surrender ceremony would make those differences visible to the entire nation. Yet to understand how deeply that moment cut, one must first see the world the Japanese women had lived in, a world built on obedience, hierarchy, and the constant demand for silence. Only then can we grasp why a single smile, offered without fear, could feel like a revelation. Before the war's end, Japan's social structure had been sculpted around obedience. Every layer of the military, from generals to the youngest auxiliary nurse, was taught that emotional restraint was not just discipline, but virtue. The state's message was simple. Composure reflected purity of spirit. To display fear was to betray weakness. To smile without reason was vanity. This mindset had been crafted over generations. From childhood, Japanese girls were raised under the twin creeds of Gammon, endurance, and Shikata Nai, acceptance of the inevitable. In wartime, these cultural codes fused with the militarist ideology that dominated every classroom. Teachers drilled patriotism with precision. Films glorified sacrifice. Songs praised the serenity of dying without hesitation. A woman's role, the government insisted, was to nurture courage, not comfort. As the war deepened, propaganda took on an almost sacred tone. Posters showed nurses binding the wounds of soldiers under slogans like, "The smile of the mother strengthens the empire." Yet the smile they depicted was not joy, but duty, a mask of calm amid destruction. Real joy was dangerous. It suggested comfort, indulgence, and humanity, qualities the wartime states sought to suppress. By contrast, the American psychological doctrine of morale was revolutionary. The U.S. military invested in what it called emotional engineering. Social scientists, film directors, and army chaplains worked together to keep troops mentally resilient. Hollywood stars toured front lines. Cartoons mocked fear. Field kitchens served hot meals on Christmas. These gestures were not trivial. They were tactical. A soldier who believed he was fighting for a better life, who could laugh at adversity, fought longer and harder. When American forces reached the Marianas and later the Philippines, Japanese civilians and female auxiliaries witnessed this for the first time. Captured diaries tell of disbelief at the relaxed behavior of U.S. troops. A Japanese nurse in Leyte wrote, "They walk openly and speak loudly, even when shells fall. They eat with gusto and some sing. It is frightening, not because they're cruel, but because they seem unafraid." That fearlessness, visible even in small gestures, hinted at a wider truth. America was fighting a war it believed it could win. Japan, by 1945, was fighting a war it could only endure. Inside Japan, the gap between propaganda image and reality widened by the day. Food shortages crippled cities. In Tokyo, women queued for hours for a bowl of millet or a few ounces of rice. Hospitals ran out of anesthetics. Patients bit down on cloth during surgery. Yet official newsreels still showed cheerful volunteers smiling before the camera, promising victory through spirit. By mid-1945, the illusion had collapsed. 29 raids had turned entire neighborhoods to ash. Even in their bunkers, the female communication officers could hear the wailing of civilians above ground. Still, the code of silence held. They wore their uniforms neatly, hair tied precisely, as if perfection could somehow restore control. When the war ended, that discipline did not vanish overnight. In the first weeks after surrender, Japan was a nation in suspended disbelief. Rumors spread of American landings, of executions, of punishments to come. The women who had served in auxiliary units were ordered to remain in place and await instructions from occupation authorities. They rehearsed their stoic faces, ready to meet the victors with dignity. But the Americans who arrived did not fit the image painted by propaganda. They smiled. They offered cigarettes and candy. They spoke through translators with casual politeness. To some Japanese women, this was unsettling, even insulting. Why would conquerors behave with such ease? Others saw in those smiles a strange mercy. It was the first time many had encountered an enemy who did not demand fear. In Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, Allied occupation forces began rebuilding cities almost immediately. American military police walked streets side by side with Japanese constables. Female officers from the Women's Army Corps, WCs, appeared performing administrative duties, and assisting in civilian welfare. For Japanese women who had spent the war under strict patriarchy, the sight of American women in uniform, independent, confident, often smiling, was a shock equal to defeat itself. Here, the contrast between two worlds became unmistakable. The quiet uniformity of Japanese duty against the expressive freedom of American confidence. One was born of hierarchy, the other of abundance. Both had endured the same war, but emerged speaking entirely different emotional languages. The stage was now set for encounters that would define Japan's understanding of its conquerors, moments when gestures, not weapons, revealed the deeper truths of victory and defeat, moments when a simple American smile would carry the weight of an empire's surrender. The first encounters between Japanese female officers and American servicemen were not recorded as battles, but as moments of mutual observation. In hospitals, at airfields, in administrative offices repurposed by the U.S. occupation, Japanese nurses and clerks found themselves face-to-face with the enemy they had been trained to fear. In the early weeks of September 1945, Yokosuka Naval Hospital became one of these meeting points. American medical teams arrived to treat wounded prisoners and civilians alike. Japanese nurses, still wearing their armbands of the now-dissolved Imperial Service, stood beside them. Eyewitness accounts describe a tension that could be felt in the air, the weight of unspoken years of propaganda. Then, something small happened. A U.S. Navy medic, checking on a patient, smiled at his Japanese counterpart. She froze, unsure whether it was mockery, but the smile lingered, unguarded, ordinary, human. Moments like this repeated across Japan. Women who had never seen an American up close began to note small details. The relaxed posture, the casual jokes, the warmth in tone. It wasn't bravado. It was the look of men who no longer lived under fear. For many Japanese women who had endured years of rationing, bombings, and constant reprimand, that smile was something foreign, a luxury of peace itself. Human gestures became the first language of post-war contact. When words failed, expression spoke. For women who had grown up being told that emotion was weakness, the sight of conquerors who smiled, not out of disrespect, but assurance, felt like the unveiling of another world. The war had ended, but this discovery marked the beginning of another kind of confrontation between fear and freedom. Behind every American smile lay a doctrine of morale carefully engineered for war. Unlike Japan's ideology of stoic sacrifice, the United States fought its battles with an understanding that psychological endurance was a form of strategy. The War Department had entire divisions devoted to maintaining fighting spirit. Soldiers rotated off the line for rest. Entertainers were deployed as much as artillery. Keep them laughing, one morale officer wrote, and they'll keep fighting. By 1945, this policy had proven itself in campaigns across the Pacific. At Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, even amid catastrophic losses, American units maintained cohesion, not because they felt no fear, but because fear was absorbed into camaraderie. Officers encouraged humor as defiance. In foxholes, jokes were passed like rations. A grin became a kind of armor. For Japanese observers, particularly female communication officers stationed in listening posts or medical units, this was incomprehensible. To smile during combat was thought reckless, even shameful. Yet when intercepted reports described U.S. Marines laughing as they advanced, the effect was chilling. Propaganda had no answer for such behavior. How could one terrify an enemy who seemed at ease with death? The tactical reality was that the American war machine was designed to prevent psychological collapse. Soldiers were not expected to die for glory. They were expected to survive and return home. That single difference reshaped everything: posture, tone, even facial expression. When the war ended and these same men occupied Japan, their calm confidence was no accident. It was the extension of a training philosophy that valued morale as much as marksmanship. The American smile, then, was not merely personal. It was institutional, the outward sign of a nation that had mastered the psychology of endurance. For the Japanese women watching, that confidence was at once unsettling and magnetic. It exposed what their own system had denied them, the right to face uncertainty without shame. War at its simplest is logistics, and morale often travels in the same supply lines as ammunition. By 1945, the United States had perfected the art of comfort as a weapon. Cigarettes, coffee, canned food, chocolate, and letters arrived with relentless regularity. Even on remote islands, soldiers ate better than many civilians in Japan's cities. Material abundance became emotional security. Japanese personnel who encountered occupation forces were stunned by the ease of it all. American mess halls serve bread and butter, a rarity in Asia. Canteens hum with phonographs. Trucks move with effortless efficiency, each vehicle gleaming with maintenance Japan could no longer afford. For women who had spent months scrubbing uniforms by hand, who measured food by grams, the scale of American organization bordered on the miraculous. This abundance bred composure. A soldier who is fed, clothed, and supplied can afford to smile. He carries not just a rifle, but a sense of certainty that behind him lies an entire continent of production, faith, and home. Japan's soldiers, by contrast, had marched into oblivion with bamboo spears and blind loyalty. Their courage was unquestioned, but it was courage born from scarcity. The technological divide became emotional. American troops carried pocket cameras, radios, and even portable film projectors. They documented victory not in triumph, but in leisure, posing for pictures, smiling beside Japanese children. In every photograph, the ease of abundance radiated through posture and expression. For the Japanese women observing them, especially those working in repurposed offices or hospitals, this abundance was disorienting. It revealed how deeply technology and psychology intertwined. The smile they saw was not simply the mark of victor. It was a natural expression of a society that had never known starvation, that had fought with machines as much as with men. It was, in a sense, the smile of modernity itself. And that modernity, confident, material, and human, was something the empire had fought to resist, but could no longer deny. The next set of angles would show how leadership, propaganda, and cultural perception tried and failed to make sense of that realization. Throughout the war, Japanese leadership depended on emotional control as much as on obedience. Commanders instructed subordinates never to show fatigue, never to question orders, and never, under any circumstances, to appear uncertain before those they commanded. The mask of stoicism was not merely cultural. It was political survival. To doubt the emperor's destiny was treason. To reveal fear was betrayal. This posture extended to the female branches of service. Directors of the Women's Volunteer Corps reminded their recruits that they represented the sacred will of the nation. Women were to smile only when directed, and only to project composure. The act of smiling became performative, hollow, strategic. When Japan surrendered, that mask shattered. The Imperial Code had offered no instruction for defeat. Officers who had commanded hospitals and communication centers now stood powerless, their authority suspended. Meanwhile, American commanders, Eisenhower in Europe, MacArthur in Asia, encouraged approachability. MacArthur, photographed with his open-collared shirt and cigarette, projected casual strength. He smiled often, not as an equalizer, but as a declaration. Confidence needed no costume. In Japanese newspapers reissued under Allied censorship, these images were reproduced for the first time. For female officers and administrators who had once modeled themselves on silent austerity, the contrast was overwhelming. Leadership had changed its face. No longer was dignity measured by the absence of emotion. It was measured by control of it. The collapse of Japan's propaganda machinery exposed this truth like daylight through glass. The empire had taught its people to mask humanity in favor of myth. America's occupation, through mere demeanor, dismantled that illusion. The smile became a quiet form of dominance, not imposed by force, but by example. And for those who had lived behind the mask, watching it break was both liberating and unbearable. To understand how deeply the American smile unsettled Japanese observers, one must see how differently emotion was coded in each culture. In Japanese etiquette, a smile could mask discomfort, embarrassment, or even sorrow. It was a shield, not an expression of joy. To Westerners, the same gesture meant openness, friendliness, or trust. The result was a field of constant misinterpretation. When American soldiers entered Japanese towns, they often smiled as a sign of goodwill, a simple effort to reduce tension. Civilians, uncertain, read it as mockery. Female officers, taught that enemies would be met with stoicism, found the gesture confusing. How could victors smile so casually? Did they not respect the gravity of what had happened? Reports from early occupation days reveal a pattern of mutual misreading. American military police tried to reassure civilians, believed they were spreading calm. Many Japanese, seeing smiles amid ruins, assumed the conquerors were laughing at their suffering. Yet over time, repetition softened fear. Children began to return those smiles. Women working in repurposed government offices noticed that American personnel did not respond to mistakes with anger, but with patience. The tone of occupation began to change, not through speeches or decrees, but through mannerisms. Cultural historians later described this phenomenon as the diplomacy of expression. The Americans, mostly unaware of its power, humanized themselves simply by being at ease. The Japanese, for whom formality had been armor, began to reinterpret emotion as something not dangerous but humane. The moment that shift took hold, the walls between victor and vanquished began to thin. Smiles became bridges, awkward, sometimes mistranslated, but real. For many Japanese women in uniform, this redefinition of emotion marked their first glimpse into a world not governed by hierarchy, but by humanity. Beneath the politics and psychology of occupation lay something simpler: survival. Tokyo, Yokohama, Hiroshima, all were landscapes of ash and absence. Families searched for missing members. Children begged by railway stations. Food was scarce. The air carried the acrid scent of ruin. Amid this devastation, the smallest human gestures gained immense weight. American GIs, often no older than 20, walked these streets distributing rations. Some smiled as they handed out tins of Spam or candy bars. The reactions they received were hesitant, confusion, then tears, then faint gratitude. For the Japanese women assigned to coordinate relief or translation, these moments blurred the boundaries between enemy and benefactor. The smile was no longer a sign of victory. It was a fragment of mercy. Many of those women wrote later that they felt torn between loyalty and recognition. They had been taught that the enemy was cruel, yet the cruelty they now saw was hunger and cold, not American malice. The moral geometry of the war unraveled before their eyes. To smile back at an occupier felt like betrayal, yet not to smile felt inhuman. This quiet crisis of conscience was perhaps the deepest wound of all. The war had ended, but the emotional discipline had demanded no longer fit the world that emerged. The Americans smiled because they could afford to. The Japanese learned, slowly, that to smile again was to reclaim a part of themselves stripped away by years of fear. In that rubble, the human spirit reasserted itself through a simple curve of the mouth, fragile, awkward, but alive. It was in these fragile gestures that the next chapter, the turning point, would begin. And that turning point would not come on a battlefield, but in a room where victory and defeat met eye to eye, and where one gesture would carry the weight of everything unspoken. The war was over, but the machinery of surrender was only beginning to turn. In the weeks after Japan's capitulation, occupation authorities moved quickly to establish administrative control. Every prefecture required liaison offices staffed by both Americans and Japanese personnel. For many women who had served as clerks or communication officers under the imperial system, this meant a sudden transformation. One day they were uniformed servants of a fallen empire. The next they were civil assistants to their conquerors. In late September 1945, one such scene unfolded in the former War Ministry building in Tokyo. Its marble corridors cracked by bomb blasts, its windows replaced with thin paper to keep out the autumn chill. Their American officers held their first coordination meeting with Japanese administrators, among them several female officers of the Women's Volunteer Corps assigned to translate and manage records. The air was tense. Every gesture carried symbolic weight. The Japanese stood stiffly, hands at their sides, eyes lowered. The Americans moved with practical informality, jackets unbuttoned, voices even. A corporal adjusted a chair for one of the women. She hesitated before sitting, uncertain whether it was a test or a courtesy. Then, something small but unforgettable happened. During the meeting, an American lieutenant, barely in his 20s, dropped a folder. Papers scattered across the floor. Instinctively, one of the Japanese women knelt to gather them. When she handed them back, the lieutenant smiled and said softly, "Thank you." The phrase, through a translator, was simple, but the smile lingered. It was unguarded, effortless, a reflex of normal human exchange. Yet in that room of silence, it was as if time paused. The woman froze, unsure how to respond. Around her, her colleagues kept their eyes forward. The only sound was the rustle of paper. Then, perhaps without meaning to, she smiled back, a small, uncertain motion that would have been unthinkable only weeks earlier. Witnesses later recalled the moment as insignificant, yet symbolic. It was the first recorded interaction in that office where a Japanese officer and an American exchanged mutual acknowledgement without tension. No salute, no command, just a smile between two people standing amid the wreckage of authority. Outside, Tokyo's ruins stretched endlessly. Factories silent, tram lines twisted, the smell of smoke still lingering from summer fires. Inside, something equally immense was shifting. The idea that power required fear. In the days that followed, that simple moment repeated itself in countless forms. At supply depots, American quartermasters joked with Japanese clerks. In hospitals, GIs thanked nurses for their assistance. Each interaction chipped away at the invisible wall built by propaganda and pride. The Japanese women trained for obedience began to see the Americans not as faceless victors, but as individuals, confident, sometimes careless, but undeniably human. And yet, beneath these exchanges, a quiet struggle endured. Many of the women felt torn between duty to their homeland and the strange admiration that grew for the Americans' openness. One nurse wrote in her diary, "They smile even when tired. It is not arrogance, but calm. I cannot decide if I envy or resent it." For the Americans, the smiles came naturally. Most had no sense of the cultural earthquake they were causing. They were young, far from home, eager to finish their duties and return to families who waited across the ocean. To them, smiling was simply polite. To the Japanese women who watched, it was almost a defiance of everything they had been taught. That dignity required silence. That composure demanded suppression. As days turned into weeks, those small human exchanges began to shape policy itself. Reports reached General Headquarters that cooperation with Japanese civilians was proceeding with unexpected civility. A military intelligence memo noted, Japanese female personnel show remarkable composure and efficiency, reactions to Allied presence increasingly cordial. The Americans believed they were witnessing compliance. In truth, they were witnessing transformation. The Japanese women were learning to navigate a new emotional landscape, one where vulnerability was no longer treason, and where a smile could be both surrender and survival. October 1945, the Imperial Palace grounds, Tokyo. The American Occupation Authority had organized a press event, a symbolic moment meant to reassure both the Japanese public and the Allied world that peace was real and the new Japan would cooperate. Representatives from the former imperial services, including a small delegation of female officers, were invited to assist in translation and record-keeping. They arrived in carefully pressed uniforms stripped of insignia. The air carried the faint scent of burning wood from nearby districts, still clearing debris. Camera crews, both Japanese and American, moved through the garden like quiet observers of history. At the center stood General Douglas MacArthur, relaxed, confident, his khaki shirt open at the collar, and beside him, a group of U.S. officers and interpreters. When the Japanese delegation approached, they bowed in silence. MacArthur smiled. It was not the theatrical smile of a politician, nor the cold grin of triumph. It was calm, direct, human, the smile of a man who believed control no longer needed to be proven. The gesture was caught by every camera. Japanese reporters later wrote that what stunned the witnesses was not the power he projected, but the ease with which he carried it. Among the female officers present, several would later describe the moment as disorienting. They had been prepared for humiliation, for stern orders, for judgment. Instead, they were met with composure. MacArthur thanked them through his translator for their assistance and spoke briefly of rebuilding. When they bowed again, unsure how else to respond, he returned the bow slightly, an unimaginable gesture from a conqueror to the conquered. For the women standing there, that half smile and half bow condensed everything they could not explain. It was power without cruelty, confidence without arrogance, and mercy without pity. The contrast to everything they had known in the imperial system was overwhelming. Leadership in Japan had always been distant, divine, unreachable. Here stood the supreme commander of the occupying forces, approachable, almost informal, and yet no less commanding. Japanese newspapers printed the photographs the next morning. In them, MacArthur's ease stood beside the rigid faces of Japanese officials. Civilians across the country saw the image and read into it their own meanings: defeat, relief, confusion, shame, and something else emerging quietly: trust. For the American press, the images symbolized victory with restraint. For Japan, they marked the beginning of emotional reconstruction. Teachers showed them in classrooms. Civilians pinned copies to walls. Female workers, many of whom had served in wartime positions, stared at that image of calm power and felt the ground shift beneath them. The conqueror smiled without fear. And in that moment, fear itself began to lose its sanctity. In the weeks following, similar encounters unfolded across Japan. In Yokohama, a group of American WCs visited a local hospital to assist with civilian administration. Their presence was revolutionary. Women in uniform giving orders to men, laughing, confident, moving freely. Japanese nurses and clerks stood frozen, unsure how to behave. But the WACs were friendly, smiling as they distributed forms and translated instructions. That day, a Japanese nurse named Midori Takahashi, who had tended to wounded soldiers only a month before, found herself laughing with an American woman over a mispronounced word. In her diary, she wrote, It felt like treason, but it also felt like breathing again. Such moments multiplied, rippling outward from individual encounters to the national psyche. Every friendly exchange eroded a century of rigid hierarchy. Every unguarded laugh carried the weight of cultural revolution. Even Japanese police records from the time note a measurable decline in hostility toward Allied forces by early 1946. What military planners called pacification was, at its core, something far more human, a population learning that peace could sound like laughter. For female officers and administrators who had lived their lives behind emotional armor, the change was profound. They began to smile in return, cautiously at first, then more freely. It was not imitation, it was rediscovery. Within months, Allied advisors noticed that Japanese staff in government buildings and hospitals appeared increasingly relaxed and expressive. For the first time in years, emotion no longer carried risk. The cameras had captured more than ceremony. They had recorded the moment when two definitions of strength met, one forged in silence, the other in ease, and recognized each other. To the Japanese women who watched, that recognition was not defeat. It was revelation. And as those images circulated, they rewrote what it meant to survive. Strength was no longer the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear define expression. The American smile, once seen as strange and reckless, became a symbol of resilience itself. From that day forward, the smile would remain on posters in classrooms, in the cautious warmth of rebuilt offices, as both a reminder of loss and a quiet blueprint for renewal. But the cost of that renewal, the emotional price of learning to smile again, would be revealed only in the aftermath. By winter 1945, the occupation was no longer a headline. It was routine. American trucks rumbled through streets where children played among bricks and ash. Flags of the rising sun hung beside foreign banners, not in defiance, but in quiet coexistence. The war had ended. But for those who had served, especially the women of the imperial services, the battle within had only begun. In government offices, hospitals, and repurposed barracks, female officers found themselves part of a vast, improvised experiment, rebuilding a nation under watch. They translated reports, organized food distribution, documented demobilization. They wore civilian clothes now, simple blouses, armbands, ration pins. Yet in their posture and silence, the ghost of the old discipline remained. But something subtle had changed. The smiles, those strange, disarming American smiles, had become part of daily life. Some resisted it. They called it shallow, undignified. A smile is for merchants, one woman told a U.S. interpreter, not for those who lost their brothers. But others, quietly, began to understand its power. To smile was not to forget, but to refuse despair. It was a declaration. We are still here. Reports from the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, in early 1946 noted a curious trend. Civilians, particularly women, displayed heightened morale and adaptability. Markets reopened. Teachers returned to classrooms. Nurses volunteered to retrain under Allied medical staff. In many cases, those who had once worn imperial uniforms were among the most cooperative. Psychologists later studying post-war Japan would point to this as one of the most remarkable social recoveries in modern history, an emotional pivot from authoritarianism to pragmatism within months. But behind the statistics lay millions of private reckonings. A former communication officer named Hiroko Shibata described it simply: "We learned to hold our heads high, but not out of pride, out of endurance. When the Americans smiled, I saw no shame in returning it. It was the first gesture that belonged to the future." Her words echoed a truth few could articulate in 1945, that emotional survival was as vital as food or shelter. The war had taught silence. Peace demanded expression. In Tokyo and Osaka, American-run cultural centers opened, offering English lessons and film screenings. Attendance was dominated by women. They came not for politics, but for a chance to understand the mindset behind that effortless calm. Hollywood films, filled with laughter, music, and smiling faces, flooded a population that had spent a decade saluting portraits. The reaction was astonishment. A report by the Civil Information and Education section recorded one teacher's remark: "We thought happiness was earned through sacrifice. These films show people who are happy just because they live. We do not know this feeling yet." The American smile, once a mystery, had become an emblem of the possible. Yet beneath the surface, contradictions deepened. Many women felt displaced, useful but invisible, liberated but constrained. The occupation granted them responsibilities unthinkable under the empire, yet society still expected obedience. Some resented the Americans' easy manner. Others feared they were forgetting what it meant to be Japanese. Still, the shift could not be reversed. A generation that had grown up reciting the emperor's rescript now watched newsreels of democracy in motion. They saw American women speak openly, laugh freely, and walk beside men as equals. For the Japanese officers who had lived in strict hierarchy, it was like watching sunlight to the fog, disorienting but undeniable. By 1946, many of those same women began to take positions in Japan's new civic institutions, education boards, health ministries, even the first local elections. When they smiled in photographs, foreign correspondents called it American influence. But it was something deeper, the rediscovery of human agency. Yet not all embraced it. For some, the silence of defeat never lifted. The nation was changing, but memories of loyalty, of loss, still clung like smoke to every wall. And in that lingering quiet, Japan stood on the edge of something fragile. The balance between remembrance and renewal. Spring 1946. Cherry blossoms bloomed again over Tokyo, pale and soft against a landscape still shattered by war. For many Japanese, it was the first time the season had felt like a beginning rather than a reminder. Reconstruction had started in earnest. Streets cleared of rubble, power slowly restored, markets alive with barter and cautious laughter. Among the silent architects of this renewal were the women who had once stood in uniform, the clerks, nurses, typists, and officers of the fallen empire. Now, they became translators, administrators, and teachers in a country learning to speak in a new voice. They carried themselves differently, still polite, still restrained, but with eyes no longer lowered. For some, that subtle change began the day they first saw Americans smile without fear. In the years that followed, Japan's press and literature began to reflect this quiet revolution. Magazines such as Fujin Korin and Shufu no Tomo published essays from women who had lived through both systems, imperial and democratic. One wrote, "We were taught that calm was strength. Now we see that kindness is also strength." Sociologists studying post-war gender roles noted a remarkable phenomenon. While men struggled to redefine masculinity after military defeat, women adapted more quickly to the language of peace. They learned diplomacy, empathy, and cooperation, skills born from survival under pressure. Many credited their early contact with Allied officers as the moment that changed their understanding of authority. For some, however, the emotional price remained high. The smile, once forbidden, now common, could feel hollow. It did not erase grief or hunger. It did not rebuild homes or bring back fathers lost in Manchuria or the Pacific, but it gave shape to resilience. In every hospital corridor, every office window, every classroom chalkboard, the quiet courage of endurance replaced the noise of command. By 1947, American sociologists working with SCAP began documenting what they called the emotional democratization of Japan. It was a subtle term for something deeply human. The rediscovery of self-expression after years of oppression. Children learned songs that celebrated peace, not empire. Women wrote openly in newspapers about their work, their dreams, even their doubts. And through all of it, that image from the autumn of surrender, the calm, unflinching smile of the victors, remained in memory. It had started as a shock, then became a question, and finally, an inheritance. Former officers who once served the imperial system began mentoring younger women entering public service. Their advice was simple but profound. Do your duty, but do not forget your face. In those words lay an understanding that had taken years to form, that dignity and warmth were not opposites, but companions. In photographs from post-war ministries and schools, one can trace this transformation. The women stand at desks or blackboards, still disciplined, still composed, yet there is softness now, a lightness once forbidden. They no longer hide emotion as weakness. They wear it as proof of survival. Across the Pacific, American observers noted it too. Reports from 1948 described Japan's social recovery as astonishingly rapid, marked by optimism disproportionate to material conditions. Behind that optimism lay the quiet defiance of a people who had learned to smile again, not in imitation, but in reclamation. The war had crushed Japan's body. Peace demanded it rebuild its soul. And in that long, uneven process, the lessons of defeat intertwined with the gifts of empathy. Those who once stood stiffly in silence beside their conquerors now taught children the language of laughter. They had learned that courage was not the absence of fear. It was a decision to face tomorrow with a calm heart. By the decade's end, few remember the exact day the change began. But in the memory of those who had witnessed it, the female officers, the nurses, the clerks who once bowed in shame before a smiling enemy, it remained clear. The smile that outlasted victory. History often records wars with the thunder of artillery, the speeches of generals, and the ink of treaties. But sometimes, what endures is quieter. The look on a face, the gesture that bridges silence. For post-war Japan, that bridge began with a smile. It was never about submission. It was about rediscovering humanity in the wreckage of ideology. For the Japanese women who had served in the imperial system, women who knew only duty, obedience, and restraint, the sight of Americans smiling without fear was not simply cultural shock. It was revelation. They saw in that ease a truth their world had concealed. That power need not harden the heart. That calm could coexist with confidence. And that dignity could live alongside compassion. In a nation rebuilding from ruin, those ideas became quiet foundations. The smile of the occupier became, paradoxically, the seed of Japan's emotional freedom. It softened the language of command, humanized authority, and taught a generation that strength did not require silence. When the country later rose from ashes to become an industrial and cultural giant, that lesson remained woven into its fabric, not in policy or economics, but in the daily grace of interaction. In every classroom where laughter replaced slogans, in every office where kindness guided discipline, the echo of that first unguarded smile endured. It was not American anymore. It was Japanese, reborn through reflection, humility, and survival. The female officers who once stood stunned on the deck of the Missouri or in ruins of the war ministry became witnesses to one of history's rarest victories, the triumph of empathy over pride. They had seen what fear could destroy, and now they knew what courage could rebuild. Because sometimes, the most powerful weapon in peace is not a flag, a speech, or a treaty, but the quiet courage to smile without fear in the aftermath of war.